When I say the word dictator, you probably imagine Stalin, Hitler, Mao, Pol Pot, and these are indeed dictatorships based on fear. These are dictators who are openly using repression. Their goal is to terrorize their citizens into submission. They even dress in military or paramilitary uniform to project force and fear. Now, today's dictators, as you can easily see, are different. Even visually, they dress in business suits, they travel to Davos, they talk to democratic leaders, and they present themselves as democratic leaders. We have a new preface where we discuss this transformation of Putin's regime from spin to fear, which was completed the first week of the full-scale invasion of 2022. He saw that independent media are very costly for him under those circumstances. He saw that people started to speak publicly, sign collective letters against the war. Popularity of Putin was collapsing every day. So what he did, he moved from the spin side to the fear side, closing down all remaining independent media, banning Facebook and Instagram, and introducing the censorship law, which was an open censorship law with brutal punishments for anybody who would stand up against Putin's war. The Russians could still in 2022, they could still leave Russia, which is again something that fear dictators usually would not allow. However, in 2023, Putin introduced the new law about digital summons, where you cannot leave Russia anymore if you are of draftable age. We still have a moratorium for capital punishment, so Putin is not executing people. But on the other hand, people understand that they can be forcibly drafted into the army, sent to the war, where probability of being killed is extremely high. Whatever Putin does now on information front, he cannot really communicate to the public opinion in the West saying this is a fair and just war and we commit no war crimes. This is now completely transparent, and the public opinion demands Western politicians to stand up to Putin.
Good day and welcome to CDI Talks. My name is Anton Shekhovtsov and I'm the chair of the Center for Democratic Integrity, an Austria-based association that analyzes attempts of authoritarian regimes to influence politics and societies in Europe. Today's episode of CDI Talks features Russian-French economist Sergei Guriev, Provost and Professor of Economics at the Paris Institute of Political Studies, or Sciences Po. From 2004 until 2013, Sergei Guriev was rector of the new economics school in Moscow, but had to emigrate from Russia because of the hostile attitudes of the Russian authorities. He joined Sciences Po as a tenured professor of economics in 2013, but was on leave from the institute in 2016-2019 as he served as the chief economist of the European Bank for Reconstruction and Development. Sergei Guriev's research interests include political economics and development economics, but in recent years he also became interested in the challenges of authoritarianism. Last year he published a book titled Spin Dictators, co-authored with American political scientist Daniel Trisman, that focuses on how a new breed of dictators manipulate information and fake democracy in order to retain power. I hope you will find my conversation with Professor Guriev interesting, and if you do, please like this video and subscribe to our YouTube channel to stay updated on future episodes of CDI Talks. Sergei, thank you very much for your time, for this opportunity to talk to you. In your most recent book, Spin Dictators, that you co-authored with Daniel Trisman, you wrote about two types of dictatorships. One is a dictatorship of fear, and the other is a dictatorship of spin. Could you please briefly describe these two types of dictatorships?
Thank you very much, Anton, for inviting me. Indeed, in this book, we talk about the evolution of dictatorial, non-democratic regimes. And we start with the observation that dictatorships are indeed different from the classical model. When I say the word dictator, you probably imagine Stalin, Hitler, Mao, Pol Pot, and these are indeed dictatorships based on fear. These are dictators who are openly using repression. Their goal is to terrorize their citizens into submission. They even dress in military or paramilitary uniform to project force and fear. Now, today's dictators, as you can easily see, are different. Even visually, they dress in business suits, they travel to Davos, they talk to democratic leaders, and they present themselves as democratic leaders. And so that's the main difference. The dictatorships today, well, not all, but majority of dictatorships today are spin dictators. They manipulate information. They pretend to be democrats. They deceive rather than terrorize. They talk to their citizens as imperfect democrats. They say maybe our elections are not perfect, maybe our governance system is not perfect, but it's still a democratic governance system. And so in that sense, the difference is whether you are openly dictatorial or you pretend, mimic democratic facade.
Would you say indeed that the goal is terrorizing the society, the citizens, but is anything there that lies beyond terrorizing your own population? What is the ultimate goal of this terrorizing?
Well, both spin and fear dictators want to stay in power. They want to survive as regimes. That's almost a Darwinian goal. The fear dictators terrorized citizens into submission, so citizens are afraid of organizing protest to stand up to the dictators. The spin dictatorships, on the other hand, try to convey a message to the majority of population that you don't need to protest against me because I'm popular, I'm with you, you have elected me. And what is an important part of this argument is that in each regime like this, you have people who understand what's going on, who don't buy this pretense, who understand that spin dictator is still a dictator and not a democrat. And so the question is, how do you silence this part of the population, people who understand what's going on, the informed class, if you like. And this is what we discuss in the book, how you use targeted but limited repression in a deniable way, when you pretend to put your political opponents in jail, but not on political verdicts, rather than you would use, in that case, embezzlement, tax evasion, and stuff like that. When you use censorship, but again, in a covert, implicit way, instead of creating a minister of censorship like it was in Soviet Union, the famous Glavolit, what you do, you co-opt media owners, or if you censor journalists or repress journalists, again, you do it in a targeted, limited, deniable way.
In your book, you also, what I found interesting, you describe how even those dictatorships of spin, how they use the digitalization or this digital realm also to somehow harass and repress people, and that sometimes goes with very real repressions.
Well, these dictators, in a sense, are a response to the new era. So they are an evolution of dictatorial species to the change in reality of globalization and technological progress and the rise of digital cross-border media and social media. And so they learn how to use this technology better. This is still a problem for them, because social media, if not censored, is a challenge which allows to circumvent media such as broadcast media, TV. And one of the things we've observed in recent years was the challenge of Navalny and Navalny's social media, in particular YouTube, that Kremlin didn't know how to address and eventually decided to poison Navalny. And Navalny is not alone. Wherever you have non-democratic regimes, you have opponents trying to circumvent propaganda and censorship using digital technology. And so that's not obvious how to address that. And so what non-democrats do, they also learn how to use social media. They jam digital channels with trolls and bots. They produce their own online propaganda. So, of course, in order to survive, you need to evolve.
I remember almost, I think, maybe 10 years ago, there was a feeling, especially with the Arab Spring, that the new type of a revolution is a Twitter revolution, that you organize on social networks or using social networks, and then you have a revolution. But now it seems that this romantic vision of revolutions is over, because these dictatorships, they also can use social networks in order to actually repress and stop the revolutions.
That's true. There was a famous notion of liberation technology. Internet is a liberation technology put forward by American political scientists, in particular Larry Diamond. And later on, especially with the election of Donald Trump in 2016, people started to talk about internet as a disinformation technology. So indeed, internet can be used by pro and anti-democratic players. Yet we should not forget that even today, digital technology helps opposition politicians in non-democratic regimes to inform each other and the population and to mobilize and protest. And mass protests in Russia in 2011, in Ukraine in 2013-14, in Belarus in 2020 were all eventually organized through social media.
In your book, you consider Putin to be a spin dictator. But now I think with more recent developments, maybe you've changed your view of Putin as a spin dictator?
Yes, that's exactly what we did. We finished the first draft of the manuscript in May 2021, and at that point we still called Putin a spin dictator, but we indicated that there are signs that he's moving to the fear side. And one sign that we mentioned is this poll run by Levada Center in the spring of 2021, where majority of Russian population say that they're afraid of the return of mass repression. You can actually remember the spring 2021 was the time of mass protests after return of Navalny, mass protests to support Navalny, to demand freeing Navalny, and that was the time when these mass protests were suppressed brutally. And also that was the time when Russian government publicly announced that Navalny has created an extremist organization. So Navalny was announced to be a political opponent rather than a crook. And so in the next edition, the paperback edition, which is coming up in May 2023, we have a new preface where we discuss this transformation of Putin's regime from spin to fear, which was completed the first week of the full-scale invasion of 2022. So when the war started in February 2022, Putin probably initially thought that would be a replay of a spin dictator's war like annexation of Crimea in 2014. But that didn't happen. So he saw, just a few days later, he saw that the war is going to take longer, it will be much costlier, and so he changed his view how he's going to treat Russian politics. He saw that independent media are very costly for him under those circumstances. He saw that people started to speak publicly, sign collective letters against the war. The anti-war petition proposed by Russian human rights defender Lev Ponomarev was signed by 1 million of people, and that was an open petition, so people actually signed with their names, leaving their contacts. So in that sense, Putin understood that things are going in the wrong direction. If you look at the polls run by Navalny Foundation the first few days of the war, you saw that popularity of Putin was collapsing every day. So what he did, he moved from the spin side to the fear side, closing down all Romanian independent media, banning Facebook and Instagram, and introducing the censorship law, which was an open censorship law with brutal punishments for anybody who would stand up against Putin's war. And even just calling this war a war. You may remember that Putin's war is called a special military operation. And so indeed, if you say something like this, calling this a war, standing up to this war, protesting against this war, this new law would put you in jail for many years. So that was the change, that was the transformation. And today, Daniel and I would call Putin's regime a fear dictatorship. The transformation is not complete, there are still some elements of spin, but the main feature is that Putin is no longer ashamed of using open repression, using open censorship, and eliminating all dissent within Russia.
But I think what is missing now from defining Putin's Russia a fear dictatorship is that still mass repressions are not as great, I mean, are not as significant as you described. I think the idea that is 1,000 political prisoners is one of those lines. I think even now there are less political prisoners, and also political killings less than 10.
Right. We are not in Stalin's times if we count number of people executed. 0 Russians have been executed by Putin's regime. However, we already see people going to jail for 25 years. This is not what Stalin did. Beyond 10 years, he would just shoot you, right? He could put you in jail several times by 10 years, but putting you in jail for 25 years was not Stalin's practice. Now, if you think about those quantitative criteria, indeed, there are still not too many political prisoners. However, if you think about mobilization, where people are forced to go to war, which is an extremely bloody war, and so a lot of people get killed. If you think about how many Russians were killed or wounded, American estimates already run into 200,000 people. So a lot of Russians have been touched by this war. The Russians could still in 2022, they could still leave Russia, which is again something that fear dictators usually would not allow. However, in 2023, Putin introduced the new law about digital summons, where you cannot leave Russia anymore if you are of draftable age. So there are some elements of fear dictatorships that are going beyond what we would ever expect. And some, of course, as you rightly said, are less brutal. So we still have a moratorium for capital punishment, so Putin is not executing people. But on the other hand, people understand that they can be forcibly drafted into the army, sent to the war, where probability of being killed is extremely high. So this is a pretty brutal level of repression. But the main difference is indeed that Putin stopped pretending that it's a democratic regime. He is adopting those laws, which are open censorship, withdrawal of freedom to exit, to travel for major part of the population. So in that sense, this is a much more brutal, cruel regime than it was.
The concepts of dictatorship of fear and dictatorship of spin, these are ideal types, which means that they do exist on paper, but in reality you have a spectrum. Dictatorship is a spectrum. But also what this transformation of Putin's regime shows us is that actually even one and the same dictatorship may travel up and down in on this spectrum from dictatorship of fear or from dictatorship of spin. In Putin's case, we see that the war has become that major reason for the transformation of the dictatorship of spin to something else, to dictatorship of fear, as you argue. What else can cause these movements in this spectrum or on this scale?
In the book we talk about this issue. We give an example of Venezuela. Venezuela is an example how spin dictatorship got transformed into a fear dictatorship. Chavez Venezuela of Hugo Chavez was a classical spin dictatorship. When Chavez died, he was replaced by Nicolas Maduro, with a major difference that Maduro didn't have a charisma, was not generally supported by Venezuelan public, and also oil prices went down exactly at the same moment. So the spin regime built by Chavez became unsustainable. So for Maduro, running a spin dictatorship turned out to be just impossible. And so he moved back to 20th century tactic. When we talk about Putin, we can also evoke example of Erdogan, who's become much more brutal in 2016 after coup d'etat, when thousands of journalists, judges, activists were imprisoned. So even the same person can move down this road. We argue, and that's an interesting question whether we are right or not, but we argue that you can only move one direction. You can move from spin to fear, but moving from fear to spin is impossible, because once you're openly repressive, once you stop pretending that you are a Democrat, it's very hard to convince people once again that you're a Democrat. And in that sense, we think it's just a one-way street. And that's why we think many spin dictators don't want to do it, because in today's world, being a fear dictator is very costly, as we see in case of Putin. Putin moved within a week from spin to fear, and that's become really, really costly for him, for the country, for the economy, and for his regime. And in that sense, it is safer to be a spin dictator than a fear dictator in today's world. And again, as we talk about this in the book, and we show the data in our research, it's very dangerous to be a fear dictator, because the more brutal you are, the more likely that you yourself will not be peacefully removed from office, but instead being overthrown, exiled, imprisoned, or even killed.
Recent research shows that mimicking democratic practices, such as, for example, elections, actually helps dictatorships to prolong their lifespan. And in your book, you also say that still holding elections in a non-democracy is a part of the spin. But what I noticed by observing Russian elections, not all of them, but some of them, is that often Russian authorities make electoral fraud publicly visible, even sometimes blatant. And probably they want to send a message that however you vote, it doesn't really matter. Yeah? We count the votes. And this, of course, is very disparaging for the society. It's also demobilizing people. Yeah? And one American political magazine in 1871, it published a caricature of a sort of a nasty, cocky man controlling the vote, and who was saying, "As long as I count the votes, what are you going to do about it?" Being very cocky about this. So it's not only about the electoral fraud, it's also about parading the fraud. So what do you think about it? Is it also part of the spin?
So this is a complex question. First, the very simple answer: yes, there is research which shows that dictatorships that mimic democracies live longer, and that's the same argument that we are making. We are saying that in today's world, people actually don't want to live in dictatorships, and this is the end of history. If you reread Fukuyama, in the sense that the grand ideologies of 20th century, such as Nazism and communism, are gone. People don't want to live under ideological dictatorships. So we show the data, we show that in international polls, majority of the world and majority of people, even in the non-democratic regimes, say we want to live in democracies. So that's why if you pretend to be a Democrat, people are less outraged. Now, your question about blatant electoral fraud is also important, because as I mentioned, spin dictators face the challenge of convincing the general public, but also somehow silencing the critical, informed class. And so basically using electoral fraud in a way that informed class is hopeless, less mobilized, deactivated. That's the idea. So the message that we can steal as many votes as we want is for the informed class, the potential opposition, the activists. But at the same time, you need to send a message to general public that elections are more or less honest. The general public may suspect that if the result of the election is 70, the true number is 60. But actually, as we saw in recent Russian history, nothing prevents you from stealing 20% of the vote or 30% of the vote. So that also happens. This balance is very complex. So we quote the famous Lukashenko's statement that once he won an election with 90% of the vote, but he actually asked his colleagues to diminish the reported results, decrease the reported results, because otherwise it doesn't look believable. So he asked actually to falsify results down, or at least that's what he said, in order to convince the general public that he's actually an honest elected leader. Now, Lukashenko is not a spin dictator. He's a fear dictator, but yet this sentiment that you have to strike a balance between reporting too much and reporting too little is just there, because you're playing the same chess, not on one chessboard, you're playing on multiple chessboards. vis-a-vis general public and vis-a-vis people who understand everything.
Just a follow-up question on this discussion about Lukashenko. I think what happened several years ago, a few years ago, after this presidential election, if we can call it election in Belarus, the repressions against the society were extremely brutal, extremely brutal. Is that also a lesson for Putin, how far he can actually go in repressions against the population?
People say that Belarus is the future of Russia. So whatever is happening in Belarus is Russia in a couple of years. So Belarus has always been a fear dictatorship. Opposition leaders were disappearing. Opposition leaders were put in jail. The previous attempt to stand up against Lukashenko 10 years ago resulted in people spending time in jail. So that's different from what Putin's regime was. But in 2020, Lukashenko indeed brutally suppressed the opposition protests. A lot of people have left. But what's going on right now is that apparently Lukashenko goes one by one using face recognition software for everybody who participated in those protests and has not left the country. This is real mass repression. Russia is still not there. Russia is still not there. But as I said, Russia is now a fear dictatorship, so that's completely plausible that in the foreseeable future we'll experience something like this in Russia as well. The other thing which Lukashenko did during those protests was torturing peaceful protesters. Ordinary people who came to protest in the street were tortured in police departments. Again, something like this was unthinkable in Russia, but it came in 2022. When anti-war protesters took to the street in the beginning of the war, we also heard about rape and torture in police departments. So yes, Putin is learning from Lukashenko. All fear dictators learn from each other. All spin dictators learn from each other. And sophisticated leaders like Putin learn from everybody else.
Engaging with outside world is one of the rules of spin dictatorships. How do they spin the world?
So this is a great question. So the way our book is structured, the first chapter tells you the main argument, and then chapter by chapter we go tool by tool through the toolkit of spin dictators. We talk about limited violence, we talk about propaganda, censorship, we talk about manipulating elections, and one of the chapters is actually dedicated to the question of using cross-border relations, political, economic, social connections with the outside world. And the main argument is that spin dictators embrace globalization. Unlike fear dictatorships of 20th century who preferred autarky, spin dictators know that globalization brings prestige, reputation, and economic benefits. So the more you are connected to the global economy, the more money, technology, capital comes your way. You create jobs, you raise incomes, you increase quality of life, and you're more popular. So that's a very simple idea, and indeed what spin dictators do. They want to make sure that they're not sanctioned. They want to make sure that people outside of the country believe that they are acceptable leaders. They may be imperfect democrats, but they are not brutal executioners. And so that's the main goal, to project this image that you can be dealt with, you can be a business partner, you can be a political partner. And so for that they use plenty of tools. They export their corruption to bribe Western politicians, they pay for lobbyists, they pay for lawyers, investment bankers, they give business opportunities to Western companies, multinational companies, so these business leaders serve as their ambassadors in the Western countries. So we describe a multitude of tools, but the goal is still the same. Keep the borders open, keep the relationships intact. So avoid isolation, because isolation is costly. Isolation is a tool of fear dictators. Spin dictators love globalization, they benefit from globalization, and they use whatever tools they can have to stay part of the global economy.
You know that what you say, what you describe with this engaging with the outside world, it also, I think, has a component of trying to influence politics in Western society, for example, in Western societies, in Europe in particular, sometimes even interfering in the elections. Is this also part of the spin or spinning the world?
This is an important part of the strategy. So basically, they need to continue projecting the image of normal partner. And for that, they work on influencing public opinion, but also democratic processes. So they support politicians who are happy to deal with them, to do business with them, and they try to diminish the chances to win elections for the politicians who want to stand up to them. And so for that, they sometimes interfere in elections through media instruments, sometimes through just bribing politicians or lobbyists. Well, I should say that the export of corruption, export of dirty money, bribing the major political actors may backfire. And sometimes people say, look, they bribe these Western politicians and Western former politicians, and that got exposed, so they lost their tools. Now, interestingly, even if corruption in the West is exposed, spin dictators are also happy because they bring this story back home and they tell their voters, look, turns out that this former leader of a big Western country is a corrupt crook. So it looks like the West is not better than we are. And so this narrative is always useful for spin dictators. Spin dictators thrive on narratives. Their main tool are narratives. And narratives like, we may not be perfect, but the West is no better, is exactly the tool they need.
It's this, the traditional technique of whataboutism.
That's exactly true. Whataboutism par excellence.
I actually many times identified this narrative about that the West is also corrupt in the speeches of Russian authorities, and that was also, I think, an instrument of convincing the Russian society that there is no much sense in trying to even mimic some of the liberal democratic practices, because they are all the same. It just public relations works better for them, but essentially it's the same.
Yeah, they send a message that the West is also run by a small elite and elections are for a show. And I vividly remembered that the Russian government was shocked and didn't know what to do when Obama won the election. When Barack Obama won the election in 2008, it turned out that he's neither Clinton nor Bush, right? He stood up against Democratic establishment, and in the general election, he beat the Republican establishment. So what do you do? And so eventually Russian narrative has changed into, well, Barack Obama is neither Clinton nor Bush, but he's a puppet of Democratic establishment. So they really need a narrative which says the West is also non-democratic and corrupt, and the elections are for a show, like in Russia.
I remember there was a few years ago, there was an article of Vladislav Surkov where he wrote that, yeah, he also supported this narrative that the West is as corrupt, as non-democratic as Russia. But his argument was, but at least we are fair, at least we are honest. We are showing this non-democratic structure of our country, while they, on the West, they pretend that they're still democratic. What you described also, this dirty money going to the West, influence operation campaigns, but it seems that the West was pretty much tolerant towards all these practices until basically only the war, until the annexation of Crimea, the war in the Donbass. But spin dictatorships, they also pose a threat to the West, do they not? Why they were not, responding or reacting to the spin dictatorship of Putin before 2014, with the exception of this Magnitsky Act? So
you can also mention the Chechen wars, brutality of those episodes of Russian history, Putin's history. And there, I think Putin has managed to sell his brutality in Chechnya as part of war on terror. That was easier to sell it after 2001. 2008 invasion in Georgia, that was an unfortunate timing or fortunate timing for Putin, because it was exactly the time of Lehman Brothers and financial crisis. 2014 was a surprise, and so when the West understood what's going on, that was a bit too late. And that's why in 2021, 2022, the West has warned Putin, the West has, and especially the United States, have leaked the information about the coming war. And so the West was prepared, the West has talked to Putin about potential sanctions and responded in a much more united and resolute way. And so in that sense, in 2014, Putin succeeded. In 2022, Putin faced a very different kind of resistance. So why it took the full-blown invasion of 2022? Exactly because spin dictatorships are so effective in manipulating information and public opinion in the West. And it took this open brutality of the full-scale invasion when public opinion has changed. So whatever Putin does now on information front, he cannot really communicate to the public opinion in the West saying, this is a fair and just war and we commit no war crimes. This is now completely transparent, and the public opinion demands Western politicians to stand up to Putin. That was not the case at all in 2014. And if Putin's plan worked out, if Putin could in 2022 do the same with a very quick capture of Kyiv, the videos of pro-Russian Ukrainian demonstrators, a new pro-Russian government in Kyiv that would declare its taking over of the country, or at least part of the country, and claiming some legitimacy because of some fraudulent election, I'm sure that it will be much harder to mobilize public opinion and political unity of the West. But part of that was that the West was already awake. Part of that was that Ukrainians were much more courageous, mobilized, armed than in 2014, and part of that was that Putin's corruption destroyed his own army. And so that was different. But overall, the short answer to your question is the West was tolerant because the West didn't understand. And that was another proof that this model, spin dictatorship, is better fit for today's realities. The model of spin dictatorship is much more convincing. And that's why it's more consistent and more successful in today's world.
We know how the West responds to dictatorships of fear. It's usually economic sanctions. It doesn't happen often that the West starts wars against those dictatorships of fear, although it does happen when those dictatorships cross a particular line. But usually it's economic sanctions. Do Western societies need also to respond to the challenges of spin dictatorships?
Absolutely, and our last chapter of the book talks exactly about what needs to be done. And since spin dictatorship is this shape-shifting form of dictatorship, you can't really pin down what's happening in those regimes. Are they real dictatorships or democracies they pretend to be? This response is not easy. So what we argue is spin dictators are actually vulnerable to these informed classes mobilizing themselves and increasing their size. And so the West should support development of civil society within spin dictatorship. So we do not support the complete autarky. We propose what we call adversarial engagement. So you engage with healthy forces within those countries, but you call these regimes dictatorships, which they are, and you protect your own Western political democratic institutions against influence, against manipulation. So that quickly becomes very difficult. So imagine there is a Russian businessman in London. Is that a legitimate Russian business person who gets rich through business transactions through legitimate business, or this is a lobbyist hired by Putin to influence and penetrate Western political life. You need to invest resources in understanding what's going on. You need to support centers like yours to distinguish between legitimate and not legitimate businesses, activists, journalists, NGOs. The West has finally understood that Russia today is not journalism. That took some time. The West should also distinguish between Russian government-funded NGOs, so-called GONGOs, right, government NGOs, and the real NGOs, the real independent NGOs. The same applies to election monitors. In the book we talk about how spin dictators create even independent electoral observers. We talk about how you think about cooperation with academics, students, and so on. So none of that is easy. But we argue that engagement with independent, informed part of the society will create more problems for spin dictators, and that needs to be done. At the same time, the pro-government forces should be somehow constrained, especially their operations in the West.
Since Putin's regime is moving, or has already arrived to this station of dictatorship of fear, is it still valid for Western societies to try to support Russian civil society in Russia itself?
Well, the West should try, but it's almost impossible. So one of the things the West is doing now, they're supporting Russian opposition abroad, which is a very important and noble task. And various foundations, various governments try to provide organizational, institutional, and financial support, for example, to Russian media who left Russia and try to project their message, to send their information, to send their programming back to Russia. And we are talking about 20-30 million of Russians who are watching independent news of Russian language broadcasting through YouTube of Russian media which are located outside of Russia. And much of that is supported by Western resources, which is great, which is how it should be. That will work until Russia blocks YouTube and other means for broadcasting from outside of Russia. But at the moment, I think it's a noble thing to do. The other thing is student exchanges, but for example, if you remember what's already started before the war regarding student exchanges with China, China is a fear dictatorship, China is a geopolitical rival, so student exchanges already are difficult because the West is suspecting Chinese students of being government agents or even spies. So these things quickly become difficult. If you support somebody within Russia with Western money, you immediately make these people potential foreign agents, and people who are designated by Russian government as foreign agents, like myself or our foundation Through Russia. For foreign agents, it's very hard to operate within Russia. So if there is somebody operating within Russia, as soon as you reach certain level of impact, Russian government will make the life for you very difficult or put you in jail. So there are limits of supporting civil society within Russia. On the other hand, civil society which leaves Russia and still is in touch with people who stay in Russia, this is a very important resource that the West should support and provide opportunities for informing Russian society still in Russia.
Thank you very much for this conversation, Sergei.
Thank you very much, Anton, for inviting me.